So there's a lot of excitement about super majors and new characters breaking through, and winning tournaments, winning these really cool super majors. Wizzy with Falcon, Axe with Pikachu, and now the question becomes, well, who's next? Who's the next character that's going to win a super major? And I'm not going to talk about Ice Climbers because some people have talked about or mentioned that to me, but Chu already won a tournament with Ice Climbers, so maybe we'll talk about post-wobbling ban Ice Climbers in another video. But in this video, I'm going to talk about Samus. And before we talk about what winning a super major is, I want to define what that means. And for me, I think honestly, it just really means just good competition among the top 10. So making sure that the majority of the players are there. It doesn't have to be all of them, but I would expect to see that if we're really seeing the viability of Samus, then we have to see the likes of like Hungrybox, Mango, Zane, Axe, Plup, Leffen. Most of those players, they don't all have to be there, but there should be a good sizable amount of them there. So that we can't really say, well, if there's a really lucky bracket, then Samus can win. We want to make sure and actually define this winning a super major as the Samus player reasonably defeats a good handful of the top players, and that they can likely do it. So with that being said, I don't really care too much if this were ever to happen at a summit, though it does increase the likelihood of winning for a Samus player because they avoid the earlier stages of bracket, and Samus is pretty susceptible to, losing to a lot of random characters. Samus is just an okay character in my opinion. And just historically speaking, Hugs, Duck, and Plup in modern Melee are like the three Samuses we think of who are the formers of Samus from like 2009 to like 2019. Of course, there's older Samus mains who have been playing the game for much longer, Wes and other Samus players that were there in the early days. And as a highlight, Hugs finished second at EVO a really long time ago. That was his best ever finish. Plup has had some runs, but he abandoned Samus in 2015 after Apex, after losing to Swedish Delight in KGH. And occasionally we see him come back to Samus, but for the most part, he only uses it as an occasional pocket counter pick against like Leffen, or if he's feeling like he needs to have fun with the tournament. So we don't see much of Plup anymore. And we see Duck, who's had some peak performances, borderline top 10 to 15 level player at certain points, but he's largely taken a step back in terms of skill, practicing and really putting his all into Melee, which is understandable. People get older. With that being said, what are some of the roadblocks for Samus? Hungrybox is probably one of the biggest ones, and though some people may point out that Duck won one set at a Canada Cup, Hungrybox took the run back and pretty much destroyed Duck in every other game, which leads me to believe that Hungrybox was experimenting with what to do against Samus, and that once he figured out, like, hey, I can lose, he reverted to his Hungrybox defensive style, and Duck really couldn't do anything about it. So although Duck has had some promise, I don't see it as a consistent measure, and it's very likely you're going to have to run into Hungrybox. There are bracket scenarios where someone else defeats Hungrybox, but Hungrybox is still really consistent. He quit his job, and it's very likely you're going to have to beat him once, if not twice, to win. All in all, I think it's like a 90% chance that the Samus players lose to Hungrybox. Maybe I'm being a little bit generous here. Mango is also a huge roadblock. Hasn't lost to a series set to Samus in over a decade. The last time I can really recall is at a UCLA tournament against Hugs, where Mango was playing Falcon and Falco, and this was secondaries back when Mango's Falcon weren't as good. Really long time. Mango's really good against Samus. He made Plup switch off of Samus, I believe, at a Shine set. It just doesn't look good, and I almost give like Mango like a 95% favorite against like any Samus player. It might be even worse than that, to be honest. And then you have SUJ and the Falcons. SUJ hasn't lost a set against Samus ever since he got good at the game, so that's another player that's had years of experience defeating Samus. Even defeated Plup. Samus has an endless win streak against Duck. I lie. SUJ lost to Hugs like once or twice in a small brief period, but overall has a very, very high, like really good record against Samus. Then you have the other Falcon players. Wizzy's really good against Samus, and then you have to look at the Sheik mains. There's Swedish Delight, Dreffen. Plup can go whatever character he wants against you and probably just destroy you. In Samus Dittos or in Sheik Samus, you're probably not beating him either. There are specialty players like KGH and Ginger who play against a lot of Samus players, so even players outside of the top 10, it's going to be really rough if you're a Samus player to go through these brackets against regions who have Samus mains who have a ton of experience against Samus. And of course, this doesn't even really mention that Samus doesn't really have a strong matchup really in the top tier. It's mostly due to largely like it's a 50-50 at best for Samus in a large amount of the matchups. And for players that are really experienced in the matchup, they tend to do really well against the top Samus players. But characters like Peach, the Mario Brothers, Ganon, they all do decently well against Samus too. So it's not like Samus gets a free pass against these lower and mid-tier characters as well. So not only does Samus have a really rough road to get into top 8 or top 16, but like the top 64 portion of the bracket, or even in like round 2 pools, it's going to be really rough, especially if you run to like a Sheik or a Falcon that is really good at the matchup. You're really going to struggle. It's almost as if you have to constantly outread your opponent. And if like your way of winning neutral is to constantly outread, then you're just simply way better than your opponent. But if that becomes a prerequisite where you're going to have to outread your opponent nonstop to win, then that means you just have to be that much better than your opponent. So overall, I think the chances are very low. And let's say hypothetically, Plup or like an Axe level player that plays Samus instead of Pikachu, ends up playing Samus, I still give it like a 1% shot, maybe a 2% shot of Samus winning. So can Samus win a major? Yeah, but it's not very likely. And I want to clarify this point that, if we were to look at the nuances of can a whatever win a tournament, technically anyone can. You can run enough scenarios. You run millions, billions, trillions, a Google amount of scenarios. Eventually, one of those scenarios you will win. If you can win a neutral game exchange, then you can technically win a tournament if you get extremely lucky. But that's not very likely to happen. So, what are some of the things that Samus can do? I think each Samus player that between Duck, Hugo, and Plup had different aspects of the game done well, but none of them had like the complete picture. So imagine if you combine all the Samuses, like Plup's raw speed, game sense, sense of zoning and spacing the air, with like Duck's game knowledge of like edge guarding and optimization and punishes, and like Hugo's like footsies, and you combine all that together, then maybe you get a better Samus. But overall, I still think that there's a lot to be explored with Samus. The big issue I do have is what is the ceiling if we optimize as much as we can? Is it good enough, or is it kind of like you discover 10 things about the game or the character, and then the other characters see what Samus does and they just readapt and learn? And the key thing we have to realize here is that a lot of the top players who destroy Samus don't actively think about the Samus matchup. So Mango, he rarely has ever been challenged or pushed to win against Samus. So like, let's say if a Plup level player started beating Mango or started beating Johnny, then they would start thinking about the matchup and going like, okay, like here's some few things I could do better. So on one hand, we can really look at this and say, well, Samus can do a lot of things better, and that's definitely true. But there are a lot of things that other players can be doing better against Samus. And I think watching KGH, there's a lot of truth to that, because even with the Fox players, even like the Leffen level players, KGH does a lot more micro level things that punish like Duck really hard that the other Fox players aren't doing. So the wealth of knowledge in this matchup, I think, is okay, but it can be pushed in both ways. So for people claiming, yeah, Samus can push the meta, they can do this and this, I really think that also applies in the other side of the coin, where a Mango or an S2J, a Hungrybox, if Samus started being a tournament threat, that they would also learn a lot more about how to abuse the matchup and Samus's limitations. So things could possibly work for one tournament. Maybe there's a person that's hiding in the lab practicing with a few players and just to win a super major, but I think a lot of those things that Samus could learn and get better will be figured out after one or two tournaments of success. And so those are like just all in all the issues I see with Samus. I think she's very limited, and although I give her a decent chance of winning compared to the other characters that don't win tournaments, I still think, for example, Yoshi and Amsa still have a higher likelihood of winning a tournament, because I just think Yoshi's a better character. And on top of that, with Samus, like, she just has so many rough matchups, and she really can't take initiative in a lot of the matchups, like against like a camping Puff, for example. There's really not much Samus can really do to approach. So just a ton of just issues and character weaknesses and limitations really make me highly skeptical that Samus can win a super major. Of course, he still can, or she still can, but everything's going to have to go right for you. And that's what I think about Samus and winning a super major. If you guys want me to do another analysis on another character, go ahead and leave it in the comments, and I'll talk about what I think about the character and the likelihood of winning a super major.